But we wanted to start with the very latest out of Ukraine. So you will recall that we were told by some members of our mainstream press and being fed by the Biden administration that Russia was going to invade Ukraine yesterday.
Yeah, yesterday, February 16th. Interesting.
Didn't pan out.
Okay.
That didn't happen. That's not to say that they will never invade Ukraine or that the danger has diminished or any of those things. But, you would think that maybe there'd be a momentary reflection of, we were fed some bad information. This didn't all pan out. Of course, you're not going to see any of that. President Biden did speak on Tuesday, so the day before the supposed invasion was going to happen. Here's a little bit of what he had to say.
We are not seeking direct confrontation with Russia, though I've been clear that if Russia targets Americans in Ukraine, we will respond forcefully. And if Russia attacks the United States or our allies through asymmetric means, like disruptive cyber attacks against our companies or critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond. But we're moving in lockstep with our NATO allies and partners to deepen our collective defense against threats in cyberspace.
Yeah, that's, certainly something. First, number one, we will respond. Drawing the line at Americans. But the real thing that concerned me there was a cyber attack. Whenever he said a cyber attack could come on any one of our companies. What does that mean? This is something, Krystal, where we have no rules of engagement whenever it comes to the escalation ladder on cyber. What is a direct threat? Cyber. Hacking a U.S. bank? Questions. Bringing down the grid? Look, bringing down the grid is one thing. Hacking a bank? I don't know. The Sony hack, for example, that the North Koreans did. We have a long history of not really understanding what exactly to do. And to me, that's just more escalatory rhetoric from the president when it's very clear that there is an off-ramp to a diplomatic solution at this point.
Yeah, so at this time when Biden was giving this particular speech, the information we had was that Russia had announced they were pulling back some troops. They put out some video that appeared to show them removing some of their soldiers and some of their equipment from those sort of more aggressive posture. Now we are being told, and this is this situation, we don't trust any of these people. Who knows? So we just have to present you what this side and what that side is saying. CNBC tear sheet, let's throw this up on the screen. NATO first says, actually, we've now verified that Russia is not pulling back the troops that they claimed. In fact, it appears that they are increasing troops later in the day. After NATO said that, then the U.S. came out and directly accused Russia of lying about pulling back troops from Ukraine's borders. They said that actually Moscow has increased and added more than 7,000 combatants into those positions. Again, that's what our administration is saying. Russia is saying they're pulling them out. I don't trust any of them, so that's where things stand. In terms of cyber attacks, this was the other thing that had people very nervous on Tuesday, is there were a series of cyber attacks. We can put this AP tear sheet up on the screen, targeted at critical infrastructure in Ukraine. We're talking about government institutions. We're talking about major banks. These were distributed denial of service attacks. They're described in this AP article as relatively low-level cyber mischief. We don't know who perpetrated these attacks. Russia seems like, primary suspect here, but
seems
we don't.
Seems like a good guess.
Yeah, seems like a pretty good guess, but they weren't able to pin it down exactly. Right. And so, the U.S.'s scenario, one of the many that they laid out, is that these cyber attacks could come before the direct invasion and the false flag and the crisis actors and all of that stuff. So people started getting nervous when they saw the information about these cyber attacks coming out. But again, the vaunted invasion did not actually happen on Wednesday. But what did happen is the Russian Foreign Ministry is trolling us. Let's go ahead and put this tweet up on the screen. They have called on Western media outlets to publish a full list of dates on which Russia will invade Ukraine for the year ahead so that Russian diplomats can schedule their vacations accordingly. Apparently, they literally did this. And one other thing here, Saagar, that is important piece of information we don't have a tear sheet for to add to this overall picture. You may be asking why there's been definitely a change in tone from the Russian side, whether or not they increased or decreased their troop levels. They certainly have projected more of an openness to diplomacy. They've kind of backed off some of their more heated rhetoric. Part of that has seemed to come from the Ukrainians themselves opening the door to, hey, maybe we're not going to enter NATO. And the very latest from that front is that they have actually floated the possibility of a referendum and having their own citizens vote on not joining NATO, with the idea that they would probably vote against it if it was going to lessen tensions with Russia here. So that seems to be a step forward in the last piece. And then, I'm curious for your latest thoughts. As we now have multiple Ukrainian politicians saying that the US and Western media have done more damage to them by hurting their economy to the tune of billions of dollars than the threat of Russian invasion has. I mean, think about that for a second. They are directly saying, high-level Ukrainian politicians are directly saying that the propaganda and the hysteria coming from Western media has caused billions of dollars of damage to their economy and has been far more devastating than what Russia is doing. That's not to say what Russia is doing is good, but that is insane when you consider all of that. And there was a BBC report on the ground on Wednesday, the day of the supposed invasion, and they went out in, public squares. The government had hung up all these unity signs, whatever, and there were protesters out. But they were out about some small business tax thing that they were mad about. So there was actually more energy around this specific government policy thing than there was any sort of panic or freak out about potential Russian invasion. So there you go.
I mean, that is just, you couldn't make it up. And this is the part where CNN and all these others are being specifically called out by the Ukrainians themselves. This is the head of Zelensky's Servant of the People Party in parliament saying that Western media hysteria is now costing the country $2 to $3 billion every month. He specifically says CNN, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal coverage worse than the top Russian state propagandists. I mean, my thoughts on this is, like you said, Russia's not a good actor here. I should be very clear. The Russian parliament actually passed a resolution basically saying if the Eastern Ukrainian separatists wanted to separate and become Russia, that they would be accepted into the Russian Federation. Okay, I mean, this is not good, right? Once again, this is setting the ground for if they did want to do a just the tip style invasion and take over Eastern Ukraine, where most of the people there are Russian speaking. There's been a hot civil war there now for 7 years, or I think 8 years now. That's been happening in the Eastern Ukrainian provinces, which are, separatist already in all but name only. That goes to show you that the ground is being set if they still want to do that. The problem, though, is the media, which is you cannot trust these people. What did we show you in our last show? CBS News being like, Russian troops have moved into attack position, according to a single U.S. official. I see this stuff constantly being blared by the Western press. Things like Estonian intelligence chief says that Russia may do X, Y, and Z. You think the Estonians don't have a very direct role as a NATO country and themselves sharing a border with Russia and making sure that the West gets whipped up into trying to do something about this? You have to question people's motivations. You can't just report these things flat out with no context. And that's the problem that we have. The situation is very dynamic. Actually, a listener to the show sent me a piece from the Wall Street Journal about exactly what I've been warning about, that we've had multiple close contacts between our aircraft as the tensions continue.
There have been 3 already, just in the past number of days.
3 close intercepts. And by the way, thank you to the former Air Force pilot who sent me a very detailed write-up about why I was wrong about this. But I actually asked another friend in the Pentagon, and from what I hear, they're equally concerned about the same thing. They don't have proper lines of something called deconfliction, where, you're like, I'm flying here, no, I'm flying here. There's a lot of big problems that are happening. And all it takes is a single incident for something like this to pop off. And then you have a major diplomatic crisis that can ratchet tensions, and you never even know what you were originally fighting about in the first place. As the situation remains dynamic, we have now 6,000 U.S. troops that have been deployed to the region. Now we have all kinds of disinformation coming out of Russia. And when when NATO tells you, how many times can you tell me that the Russians are moving to attack position and then nothing happens? What's happening? I mean, are they just going there and back and there and back? Here's the other question. Why are there new U.S. journalists who are on the ground with our troops? Oh, because the Pentagon correspondents are literally banned by the Pentagon currently? from not being embedded. That's another reason I don't trust them.
That is really crazy.
All I got to rely on are these guys doing stand-ups outside of the stand-up is like a report outside of the Capitol in Kiev. That's not enough for me. I mean, I want to see on the ground level stuff, but you're not allowed to do it. I love they're using COVID as an excuse too.
And we're going to get to some of the reporting that is coming out of Ukraine.
Right? Yeah. Oh, yeah. The stuff that they are showing you.
Lauding the training of the literal Nazis that we're allied with there and who we've been funding and arming. We'll get to that in just a moment. Thank you, NBC News and Richard Engel.
Oh, my God.
Michael Tracy had a good piece, too, where he actually talked to a member of parliament, a Ukrainian member of parliament, who described the conduct of the U.S. media as, quote, crazy, and forecasted that $10 billion in cash infusions would be required to stabilize the country as a result of these, quote, alarmist foreign provocations, and that it's that dynamic that is most likely to cause the destruction of the Ukrainian state, not a purported Russian invasion. Now, what the press has been trying to persuade people is, the reason the Ukrainians are downplaying the risk of the Russian invasion isn't because the risk isn't real, isn't because, our CIA and our administration aren't being straightforward about what the real risk is. It's because they don't want economic chaos. But as Michael points out in this piece, I mean, an actual Russian invasion would be far greater economic chaos. Yeah. So they don't have an incentive here to, hide the ball and pretend like, oh, it's all fine, when they in fact know that it's really not all fine. And let me also say, the fact that there wasn't a Russian invasion on Wednesday when we were told that that was the date also doesn't mean that it will never happen. And I think we should be really clear about that. But I saw an analysis, someone who's, an expert on these things and who was evaluating the propaganda that was coming out of Russian state media. And they said this is not propaganda that is prepping people to be behind an invasion and be behind a war. What they're selling to their public is basically like, we got one over on the Western media and, the U.S. without even having to fire a shot. They freaked out. They melted down. Now we have credibility. Now they're listening to our concerns without us having to do anything. So that's sort of what they're prepping. They're prepping their population for there's not going to be an invasion. And we already basically won with the actions that we've taken. So that's important as well. But, there was one piece that was worth actually paying attention to in the New York Times, which we did want to highlight, because it gave a little bit of texture to some of the concerns and why Russia may be behaving in some of the manner in which they are. Let's go ahead and put this tear sheet up on the screen. It says, on the edge of a Polish forest where some of Putin's darkest fears lurk, a U.S. missile facility in Poland is at the heart of an issue animating the Kremlin's calculations over whether to go to war against Ukraine. The issue that they highlight here is a military installation in this small town in Poland, which is very close to Russia. It's barely 800 miles from Moscow itself. It's only 100 miles from Russian territory. And what the U.S. has said is located at this military installation is basically anti-ballistic missiles. They say aimed at shooting down any missiles coming from Iran. But the Russians look at this and go, is this really just for Iran? And also, how do we know that this is just about defensive capabilities and that you couldn't easily retool this facility to be aggressive and offensive? And I think, if you put yourself in their shoes and you imagine that kind of installation put in place by Russia in Mexico, you could imagine that we would not be incredibly comfortable with that either. And it also gets to our backtracking from what was long-held Cold War doctrine with regard to nuclear deterrence, which was the famous idea of mutually assured destruction. Part of that was in 1972, Russia and the U.S., who were both working on developing anti-missile systems, agreed to step back from that because the whole idea of mutually assured destruction is that both parties have to be vulnerable.
That's right.
And so if you have one party that has incredibly effective anti-missile defense systems, then they're protected and you don't have that same deterrent effect. It was under George W. Bush that we stepped away from that. And ever since then, of course, Putin and Russia have become increasingly unsteady, uncertain, aggressive in certain ways. And part of it goes back to this base in Poland and another one that is in Romania. So again, these are the sorts of pieces that we should see a lot more of that actually helps you to understand the real dynamics of what's going on here and doesn't just fall back on this cheap and easy narrative of Russia bad, Putin evil, mastermind, pulling the strings all around the world, because then you have more information to evaluate what might actually work in terms of diplomacy, what might actually work to de-escalate and not end up with a hot war on European soil.
We could have this conversation. Putin is bad, okay? He's pissed about this base in Poland. Do we really need it? Can we keep it in Turkey? Oh yeah, we actually do. Turkey's also a NATO country. We have Incirlik Air Base, all of that. Is it possible to have roughly the same amount of strategic deterrence against Iranian missiles, as well as balance our tensions in the East? This is what real diplomacy looks like. This is what actual strategy looks like. You and I can have a rational conversation, even by accepting the basic fact that, yes, this is obviously an aggressive move, but also trying to understand the legitimate concern. I've said this from the top. Look, just give them what they want. Tell them, and there's no sane person on earth who thinks Ukraine should actually be a part of NATO at this point. Just say it. It's never going to happen.
Well, even the Ukrainians are stepping back from that.
And even the Ukraine, and look, even if they wanted to, I'm sorry, Ukraine, look, this is nuclear war that we're talking about here. We have to think about our interests at the very first. We should have had a big debate in this country about expanding NATO all the way up into the Baltics, in my opinion. I don't think any of those states should even be within NATO, but they're already in there, so what are you going to do? But from my perspective, we have to absolutely just put it off the table. And then if they still invade and are still being aggressive, then you can show that they're full of it completely. And just be like, look, we literally said it's not going to happen, and then they're still acting aggressive. Oh, it turns out that this is much more about revanchism. Take it off of the table and take any legitimacy that there possibly could have to the world, or even to China as well, who they've now had an alliance with on this. Remove that from the negotiating table, and let's see how much of this is actually about belligerence. But there's too much hubris here in Washington, Krystal, in order to simply do that. All Joe Biden has to do tomorrow is stand at the podium and say, look, Ukraine, we stand with you. We have a long-standing alliance. We support your right to have a democracy, but you are not going to be a part of NATO because we recognize that we live in a dynamic and a complicated world. I don't see what's so hard about that.
Yeah, and obviously we have a lot of potential influence and leverage that we could use with the Ukrainians in terms of economic incentives, in terms of
we should back up their economy too, since we're the ones who are crashing it apparently.
Well, we should 100% be doing that. But we can use some of that leverage to push them in the direction of a referendum of the type that they're contemplating here, and some more vocal language about, hey, what Zelensky said was basically, this may be a dream, this entry into NATO, basically stepping back and saying, we might have wanted this to happen, but it may not be worth the price of admission. So that's where things stand today. I always want to emphasize a very dynamic situation, just because there's been the invasion date was missed and the false flag hasn't happened yet. And I certainly, you still have a lot of Russian combatants in, aggressive postures and all of that. So tensions are not gone. Something bad could still happen now or down the road, but the date certain of February 16th came and went without them invading. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.